Okay, as promised, we're going to start promptly this session. I hope you had a good lunch and are ready for part two of today's proceedings. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Suzie Pak, who is one of the foremost business and economic historians in the United States today. She's a professor of American history at St. John's University in New York. Her research specializes in the history of banking networks in the United States. Her first book is called Gentlemen Bankers. You might see an image of it soon. Gentlemen Bankers, The World of J.P. Morgan, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2013. She's a member of the editorial advisory board of the Business History Review. She's also on the editorial board of the Financial History magazine of the Museum of American Finance, and other editorial boards. She will speak to us today on Jewish American bankers and the Ford Motor Company's IPO. Please welcome Professor Suzie Pak.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Tony, Rebecca, Gwen, and Roz Greenfield for having me here to speak at the Summer Institute this year. So my talk today is on American Jewish bankers and their role in the syndicate that underwrote the Ford Motor Company's initial public offering in 1956. So the Ford Motor Company's IPO in 1956 was the largest common stock offering in history. But I wanted to start by giving you a background of how this project came to be. And in the process to do that, I have to go back to the origins of my book, Gentlemen Bankers. And so as I talk about Gentlemen Bankers in the process, I'm going to talk a little bit about history and also about doing historical research. So my work on banking networks actually started as a dissertation on U.S. foreign policy in East Asia and its relationship to U.S. immigration policy before the Second World War. And as a social historian, I really came to the study of banking in a very roundabout way when I realized that it was really impossible to study U.S. foreign policy in the interwar period without looking at private bankers. And the reason for that is that during the interwar period, the United States government had an informal policy known as dollar diplomacy, where they would leverage the loans that private American bankers made to countries like China and Japan, usually to develop things like their utilities or their railway systems. And then they would leverage that debt for American political interests. The top American international investment bankers at that time were led by Kuhn Loeb and Company, which is a German-Jewish firm founded in the US in 1867, whose senior partner, Jacob Schiff, had helped to finance the Japanese government's effort during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, which, as you know, Japan won. And his counterpart was Pierpont Morgan, whose firm J.P. Morgan and Company was known as an Anglo-American bank because it had very close ties to England and France. And both were members of an international banking consortium to China in 1909 called the IBC that financed a railway called the Hukuang Railway. And that's how I got to know the banks. And as all historical projects do, my study of American private bankers began with a question. And that is that as I was studying this community, I became preoccupied with this question that would not go away. It kept coming up, which was that how do these bankers, in a business like private investment banking, which is very personal, right? It's not what they call arm's length, it's not transactional. These bankers, in the tradition of British merchant banking, were unlimited liability private partnerships. That means the partners are the owners of the bank. They are personally liable for its profits and its losses. So if they make a bad deal, you can come and take their house. It's not a corporation, right? Because of this, they are less regulated than a corporation, but their risk is so much higher, right? So when they do underwrite a railway for $10 million or something like that, they cannot take on all the risks by themselves. They have to share it with their friends. And they have to know that their partners and their friends are credit worthy, right? So one of the things that I noticed about Kuhn Loeb and J.P. Morgan is that people like Vincent Carozzo, who probably knew more about the Morgans than anybody alive, he was a professor at NYU, said that they work very closely together. And this was very interesting to me because I thought this is the late 19th century, early 20th century. In the context of anti-Semitism, what is the basis of trust? How do you work with somebody who you may not necessarily trust? And the reason for that is because they had very separate social networks. And I knew that Jacob Schiff would not work with a bank or a banker or a businessman who he considered to be anti-Semitic. And in fact, he refused to do business with the Erie Railroad because the president of the railroad was very openly anti-Semitic. And in his letters to his partners, which are at the American Jewish Archives, he says something like, as able as he is, this guy named August Corbin, he said, I cannot do business with him because of because of his attitudes towards Jews. So the book became really a question about this community, and at first, what I did is I tried to see, I don't like to assume things, so when other people said, yes, the Jews and the WASP do business together, I said, well, we actually have to test this, because if we found out, in fact, that they didn't do a lot of business together, then we would just end the question right there. We would be done, right? The other question is, were they actually as socially separate as we thought they were? Because if we found out that they were actually very socially close, then that would also be done. And this had never been tested, and the reason for that is because in order to do it, the Morgan Library, which is in the city, it's Morgan's old house. It was actually his house, a house that he bought on the corner for his son, and then they bought the house in the middle, and they bashed that down and they created a garden. And if you've ever been to the Morgan Library on Madison Avenue between 36th and 37th Street, that's the entrance now to the new museum. And then there's a library in the back. So I spent many years there looking through things like this, and this is Morgan's syndicate book from he had 12 syndicate books from 1894 to 1934 when he had to get out of the investment banking business because of the Glass-Steagall Act during the Great Depression. And these are very large. So they're about this big and about this fat. So I'm short, so what I had to stand to read them like this. And what I did is when I saw these books, I thought, what they basically show us is they show us a picture of what Morgan's network looked like. This is an example of a deal for U.S. Steel Corporation, which in 1901 was the first billion-dollar, valued as the first billion-dollar corporation. And so the book, I know it's very faint, but basically the book will list, in this picture, it lists all of the people who got a participation, which basically means that you were a friend, right? So the more money that you got in a participation, the closer the friend you were. And what I realized is that if I actually went through all of their deals, this is for the a threshing company, and you can see the different, there's always 3 different levels of a syndicate. There's the original purchasers, so they get it at a bigger discount, and then they sell it to another banking group at a smaller discount, and that's how they make money. They make money off the spread. And then the last group is the selling group. And this is an example of J.P. Morgan and Company's private list. So if you're on the private list, which in 1912, Samuel Untermeyer, who was the counsel for the money trust investigation, tried to find out who were J.P. Morgan's syndicate participants. And Pierpont Morgan basically said to him, I don't really see how you're ever going to find that out. So you just have to wait 100 years, and then you can go to their library. But this gives you an example of how close or good this deal was, because if you see in the 5th line, Mrs. Jane Morgan, that's Jack Morgan, J.P. Morgan Jr.'s wife. So if you were participants in a syndicate, it gave you an indication of your relationship to the bank. The more times you participated in multiple syndicates over time, it gave me an idea basically of what I would call your friendship, your working relationship. And so what I did is I basically coded, it took me about 2.5 years, Morgan's syndicate books from that primary source that you saw into a series of Excel files. So this is Kuhn Loeb's list. So anytime Kuhn Loeb showed up on any one of the deals, I had just a Excel file for them, and I would keep track. And then I would keep track of all the deals. And so I could give you a relative idea of how much business JP Morgan did with the Jewish banks versus the not Jewish banks. Does that make sense? Right? Because you have to look at, there's no way to cut corners. You have to get the whole in order to look at the relative part. And that's why it took so long. But in the end, as you could see, and I coded them by, commercial banks always have more money than private banks, so you would expect them to be, greater. But if you look just at the syndicate partners, Kuhn Loeb is number 4 after 2 commercial banks and 1 basically WASP Boston Brahmin Bank called Kidder Peabody and Company, which I'm sure you've heard of. So that really answered the question, yes, they do a lot of work together. And the frequency and the different kinds of clients and over time, that was really the answer to that question. Then I had to look at whether or not they were actually socially separate. And for that, I looked at their social clubs. There's a story in the book that I talk about when JP Morgan's daughter, Juliet, she got married relatively late, for basically the early 20th century in her 30s. And she married a guy named Herbert Satterley, and whose papers are at the Morgan Library. And when they got married, he sent a copy of the social register to his mother with a blue pen and a red pen. And he said, please underline the people who would get church invitations in red, and then church and reception invitations in blue, or something like that, and then send it back to me. And apparently in another letter, which is missing, but you can see his response, she must have asked him, what am I supposed to do if I want to invite somebody who's not in the social register? And he writes back and says, well, jot them down from time to time if you find them, basically. And so this was kind of like their Facebook, right? This is how they knew if you were okay. So the idea was, were Jewish bankers also in the social register? Can we see, can we measure their social ties this way? And there were a few, but there were very few. I'll give you an idea of what it looks like. On the left-hand side, these are all the club abbreviations. So there are many different clubs. There are also clubs for women. This is an example of, if you could see JP Morgan's, in the very bottom you could see JP Morgan's listing. I mean, the amount of information that people had about bankers, this is like having Bill Gates' information, is really astounding. So you can see it says his name, Morgan, Mr. and Mrs. J. Pierpont, Francis L. Tracy, which is his wife's maiden name. It gives you all of his clubs, Union, University, Knickerbocker, Brook, Union League, Metropolitan, Century, New York Yacht, etc. At the end, when it goes to MTW, that means Metropolitan Washington. EYB means Eastern Yacht Boston. And then the women's clubs always come at the end, Colonial Dames and Colony, which are 2 women's clubs. And then you can also see that his daughter, Anne, she never married, lived with him, and it has her clubs. And then on the right-hand side, you have the address, and you could also see it says, Mr. ABD. What do you think that is? Say it again? What do you think that tells you? Arrived, yes. Arrived, yes. So what it tells you is it says arrived. So AVD means arrived and ABD means aboard. And the OLYM is referenced most likely to a ship. So basically it tells you when they're in town. It also gives you an idea that they didn't spend a lot of time together. Because when he was in Europe, she was here, and when she was in Europe, he was there. But that is how much information you see in the social register. It's quite astounding. So I did the same thing for multiple banks. I looked at their social clubs. The other thing that I did is, because I'm a New Yorker, I was born and raised in New York, when I started looking at their social register addresses, you start to get a sense of their neighborhoods. And so one of the things that I did is I started to map them using GIS technology. And you can see these are the Morgan Partners residences in 1910. They lived basically in Murray Hill, really close basically clustered around to each other. Now, it was very difficult to find the German Jewish bankers because they were not listed, except for Mortimer Schiff and Otto Kahn, who were two of Jacob Schiff's partners. Mortimer was his son. You really don't see them in the social register, so it's hard to get an idea of what their social networks were. So what I did is I mapped, this is the Morgan, what is now the Morgan Library. The building on the left is still standing. The building on the right has been bashed down. This is looking south towards 14th Street. What I did is I mapped where the Jewish partners lived. And as you can see, they lived in two different neighborhoods. So in the book, I talk about how, yes, okay, now we've answered the second question, which is that, yes, they do have these kind of different social networks. But then, of course, the problem remains, which is how to determine what was the basis of their trust, right? We're kind of back to the original problem. So this is Jacob Schiff's house, very nice house, 78th Street. There's a picture of Schiff actually at the funeral of E.H. Harriman, who's one of his business associates and friends. So in the book, one of the things that I argue is that the way in which we have to understand the basis of trust between the German Jewish bankers and the Anglo-American bankers is that we can't just look at how socially separate they were in their homes. We actually have to look at their relationships at work. And so what I did is I also mapped where their business addresses were, and you can see how consolidated they are down in Wall Street. Right in the center of the picture is J.P. Morgan and Company at Wall and Broad, and that's why it's called the corner. This is a picture of what it looks like today. This is a building that was built in 1914. Before that, there was a very large kind of Gilded Age Beaux-Arts style building that it shared with multiple different banks, and then when they bashed it down and they built this one, it was only J.P. Morgan there. But the point I make in the book is basically that if you want to understand the basis of trust of the German Jewish bankers and the WASP bankers, you had to place the bankers in a broader context and study them in their society. That fundamentally you could not understand how they created trust, and this is where it kind of goes in a strange vein for business history without looking at the position of women in their communities, and specifically how women were segregated from financial firms. So the idea that I posit in Gentlemen Bankers is that the significant separation in the community of investment bankers is not that they lived far apart from each other and their communities were socially separate. It was that where they lived and where they worked were very far apart. And where they lived, that's where women were. And where they worked, there were no women there. And in fact, at J.P. Morgan's case, women were not allowed in the bank except on New Year's Day when the bank was closed. And the wives came to lunch. And there was a partner named George Perkins who had come from New York Life. And there were more women in insurance and financial services, and he had actually a female secretary, and she was not allowed to come into the building. He had to hire an office for her in the Equitable building down the block, and then he would go talk to her, and then he would come. And eventually she was allowed in the building, but she was not allowed on the trading floor. And so their absence in the world of the firm, their presence in the world of the home and society is really taken for granted, but it's really an integral part of the social and gendered relations in the world of private banking. So how does this get us to the Ford project? Over time, I knew that this changed, right? Women are going to enter into financial firms. Minorities also enter into financial firms. Anti-Semitism becomes less acceptable after the Second World War. In fact, we start to see this in the correspondence of the Morgan partners in the late 30s. And to study this question, which is how does the investment banking community change after the Second World War, I began this project on the Ford Motor Company. So the Ford Motor Company's initial public offering, IPO, is considered, as I said, iconic in financial circles because it was the largest common stock offering in history up until that time. It had a network of 722 underwriters and 1,500 security dealers. They offered 10.2 million shares of the Ford Motor Company to the public at $64.50 a share. And it is really seen as kind of a snapshot of American investment banking in mid-century because it covered all of the regional markets in North America, including Canada. The Ford Foundation, which owned the shares, wanted to have a very wide distribution of the shares. And so the way in which the banks were chosen was I think that they chose basically the top banks in each market. The 7 co-managers represented the top investment banks at that time were Blythe & Company, First Boston, Goldman Sachs, Kuhn Loeb, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner and Bean, and White Weldon Company. The only top investment bank that was absent was actually Morgan Stanley, and that's most likely because they were known as General Motors banker. And as we'll see, the credit, though, went largely to Goldman Sachs under its senior partner, Sidney Weinberg, who was really credited with bringing the IPO to fruition. Now, being a member of the Ford IPO syndicate was a point of status and prestige, and it was a big issue for investment banks. Where on the tombstone, which is the public statement of the offering, I'll show you, would they be on? Oh, sorry, this is a picture of Otto Kahn. I don't know how that got in there, but it's a very nice picture. That's his daughter, Margaret, in the middle. And there's a very long story in a footnote about it. And the woman on the left, I believe her name is Beatrice Byrne, and I'm almost positive she's the daughter of a Catholic financier and lawyer, who was the first Catholic overseer at Harvard University. J.P. Morgan Jr. was not happy about that either. Oh, great. Okay, so this is the Ford Motor Company's tombstone. In the Lehman Brothers papers at Harvard Business School, there's some wonderful correspondence between Robert Lehman and Lee Limbert, who was the syndicate manager at Blythe & Company, where they discussed the order and placement that firms would have on the tombstone. Who should go first? Why should they be ranked this way? In her biography of Goldman Sachs, Lisa Endlich, who used to work there, writes about how John Whitehead, who had assisted Weinberg on the deal, he later goes on to be Goldman's co-senior partner, was so proud of the Ford deal that he had a copy of this tombstone in his office. It was framed and without glass. And over time, one of the reasons why the Ford syndicate is so important today is it's kind of used as a barometer for how much the field has changed, because most of the firms no longer exist. So in the lore of John Whitehead, Whitehead supposedly had a red pen, and anytime one of the competitors would go under, he would cross them out. Right? According to Roy Smith, who was also a former Goldman investment banker, Whitehead gave a version of this tombstone that had all 722 underwriters to the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1969, but that it was kept in the chairman's office at Goldman Sachs until the 1990s, another version, and that from a distance, the tombstone looked like it had been written in red, because almost everyone goes out of business. As we'll see, only 12 are left standing, because after Merrill Lynch was taken over by Bank of America in the 2008 crash, Goldman Sachs becomes the only manager of the Ford, on the Ford tombstone that is still in business as an independent entity under its original name. So in 2016, the Museum of American Finance and I began a research project called Where Are They Now? To investigate what happened to the investment banks of mid-century. And we started by looking at one of the tombstones. There were many different versions of the tombstones. You could have one that had everybody. You could have one that had everyone who had more than 1,500 shares or 11,000 shares. So we did one that looked at basically 207 firms that was published in Barron's in 1956, all the firms that got more than 11,000 shares. And what I did is I reconstructed basically a genealogy of each bank, of the 207 banks, from their origin to their demise. It's basically a history of American banking consolidation. But while working on the project, I wanted to take the opportunity to think about another question, and that was basically about the figure of the Jewish banker, which again, as I said, if you want to do anything of that kind, you have to look at the whole first, and then you have to do a comparison. You have to do a relative comparison. And the reason why I wanted to focus on the Jewish banks in the syndicate is because in recent years, there's been a resurgence of scholarship on Jews in the economy, which is part of a substantial movement in the literature in Jewish history towards what has been called an economic turn, broadly defined. And there's a strong argument that the study of Jews in the economy has been marginalized, and as a result has neglected very large swaths of the Jewish experience to the detriment of both the profession and academic research. And of course, the reason for this is that even though we know that the concept of a Jewish bank has a historicity, meaning that it has a, quote, verifiable past, that there are cultural perceptions of a past, of not just a concept, but of something called the Jewish bank, it's one imbued with a very long and problematic history of representations of Jews and their relationships to money, specifically money lending. So because it engages so directly with the ways in which anti-Semitism has informed Jewish identity, discussions of Jewish banks and those of Jewish bankers have been long taboo. As Jerry Muller has noted, quote, even today some Jews regard the public discussions of Jews and capitalism as intrinsically impolitic, as if conspiratorial fantasies about Jews and money can be eliminated by prudent silence. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, some still believe that the mere mention, quote, that many bankers are Jewish is anti-Semitic. But we have many debates about definitions of Jewishness in theological debates, about civil rights cases, philosophical discussions involving religious organizations and practices and beliefs. So one of the questions that I wanted to address is, what does it mean to call an economic institution Jewish? What is a Jewish bank? Is it a bank founded by Jews? Is it a bank that only employs Jews? Is it a bank that provides credit to Jews? Is it even meaningful to call a bank Jewish? In a recent paper I wrote for American Jewish History Journal, I argued that the definition of a Jewish bank should be defined historically and in a relational model, meaning that it starts by identifying banking houses founded by Jews and studies them over time in the context of their peers. And one of the things that I found is that historically a Jewish bank is not defined theologically. It's not distinguished by the peers, from its peers by the religious practices of its founders or members. And in fact, you could have a lot of discrepancy even within a bank like Kuhn Loeb between, for example, Jacob Schiff or Otto Kahn, who are very different in terms of their religious practices, but both very proud to be Jewish. A Jewish bank was not one that only catered to Jews or only employed Jews or only financed Jewish companies. So even if they had these characteristics at some point in their history, banks founded by Jews as historical entities changed over time. They were not static. And the reason why this is important is that the diverse histories of these institutions contradict the notion that anti-Semitism can be used actually as a constant or ahistorical thread to define Jewishness and Jewish identity, even when you have anti-Semitism in the society at large, meaning that there is so much more when we look at the empirical evidence of the networks and the history of banks founded by Jews, that it goes beyond saying that anti-Semitism can define what is a Jewish bank. So what I argue is that I wanted to start by looking at the actual histories of banks founded by Jews and then look at what they have in common and what they don't have in common. It's also a similar idea that maybe we're going to look at multiple banks founded by bankers who identify as Jewish, and they have very little similarities. That's entirely historically possible. So that was something that I wanted to test. So of the 207, this is a example of an article series. So now for the museum, Where Are They Now is a series in the Financial History magazine. These are all the 7 syndicate co-managers. You see Weinberg sitting in the middle. To his right, so to our left, is actually John Schiff, who is Mortimer Schiff's son. So he's the 3rd generation of Kuhn Loeb partner. Okay, we're going to get to Henry Ford soon. So of the 207 firms that I studied in the syndicate, 31 were determined to have been founded by men who identified as Jewish. So it's about 15% of the total. And Jewish self-identification among the bankers was determined by looking at multiple sources. So I looked at each bank's founder, and if there was more than one person listed in the title of the bank, I picked the first person. Through the census, through death indexes, through obituaries, grave locations, business directories, biographies, and other secondary sources like the Concise Dictionary of American Jewish Biography or Who's Who in American Finance. And in general, the data set skewed on the side of caution. So if I did not find definitive evidence that a banker identified as Jewish, he was not included. So the question is, were there distinguishing characteristics shared by the banking houses founded by Jews as compared to those founded by non-Jews? And as we'll see, the answer is yes. Were there differences between these firms as they changed over time in terms of generational change, in terms of their longevity? With regards to the former, the answer is yes to a certain extent, but with regards to their demise, the answer is no. Were there connections between the firms, or did they exist separately from each other? The findings suggest that there was a historical community of Jewish bankers within the investment banking sector from the late 19th to the mid 20th centuries of banks in the United States who were distinguished from their peers by their ethno-religious ties, family ties. And their common characteristics were cultural and historical. They were not conceptual or essentialist. They were not simply a response to anti-Semitic exclusion. Rather, they were largely part of historical networks of German Jewish banking families. Now, this may not be very surprising that banking houses who are founded by Jews have relevance beyond their individual stories. But as we shall see, it's not one that really lasted beyond the late 20th century or past 3 generations. And that's one of the reasons why studying the Ford Syndicate has value in the literature, because it deals specifically with the question of change over time. So to begin with the syndicate, I know it's difficult to talk about the Ford name in the context of American Jewish history without acknowledging the controversy of Henry Ford's anti-Semitic views. And that is particularly true with regards to this paper because Henry Ford played a direct role in linking the term Jewish banker to anti-Semitic conspiracies on international economic power. In the 1920s, he mobilized his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, along with the dealerships of the Ford Motor Company to, quote, carry on an active anti-Semitic campaign. And given his views on bankers in general, one wonders how a banking syndicate that included Jews could bring his company to market, especially because Ford himself had no intention of public ownership for his firm. So in 1919, when Ford was sued for his low dividend policy by the Dodge brothers, who were minority shareholders, he purchased all the shares that were outstanding of the company, and then he took the firm private. If he had been alive, and he lived for a very long time, he doesn't die until 1947, if he had been alive in 1956, the IPO might not have taken place when it did. In 1936, however, Ford also inadvertently created the vehicle for the IPO, which was the Ford Foundation. During the Great Depression, Congress passed the Revenue Act in 1932, which dramatically increased estate and inheritance taxes. So between 1932 and 1935, estate inheritance taxes went from 42% to 75%, right? We complain about taxes today, right? 75% for estates over $10 million. So in response to that, Henry, and he only had one son named Edsel, created the Ford Foundation, and what they did is they endowed it with almost 90% of the Ford Motor Company's stock, but it was specifically non-voting A stock in order to safeguard their family capital and ownership of the Ford Motor Company in the event of their death. So voting rights resided in outstanding shares of B stock, which were owned largely by the Ford family. The Ford dealers and Ford executives had a small number. According to Dwight McDonald, quote, if Edsel and Henry Ford had left their Ford stock to Edsel's children instead of to the Ford Foundation, their heirs would have had to sell most of the shares they inherited in order to pay the inheritance tax, unquote. So as a means to the end, the foundation was intended to have a limited function. Edsel said, quote, the Ford Foundation will take care of the various charitable, education, and research activities that I don't care to personally. It will be on a small scale, and I have no intention of making it larger, unquote. So Edsel dies of stomach cancer, very tragically, in 1943, and then Henry Ford Sr. dies in 1947. By this time, because there's additional family donations through their deaths, the foundation's endowment of the Ford Motor Company shares continues to rise. By the early 1950s, the foundation has grown into an entity in its own right, and it has started to distinguish itself from the motor company and also from the family. The shares of the motor company that were offered for sale in the IPO belonged to the foundation. And the reason why they wanted to do this is because they wanted to, one, diversify their investment, but also they had no idea how much money they were going to have every year to give away because it all depended on the dividends from the Ford Motor Company. But in order to sell the shares, they had to create a market for it, which had not been done, a public market. And that's where the investment bank comes in. So the IPO represents an important moment in the history of that separation between the foundation and the company and also the family. The Ford family still played an important role in both the foundation and the motor company, and they continued to do so really until the early 1970s. But a noticeable shift takes place under the leadership of Henry Ford II, who was Edsel's oldest son, who took his father's place on the board of trustees of the foundation in 1943 when his father died, and then assumed the presidency of the Ford Motor Company in 1945. There was a kind of a struggle that happened. In contrast to his grandfather, Ford II's relationship with Jews in the Ford II, they called him Young Henry. Relationship with Jews in the post-World War II era was not antagonistic. According to A. James Rubin, when Ford II, quote, assumed control of the company in 1945, he began a lifelong campaign to support both the American Jewish community and the state of Israel, unquote. Ford's papers, which are at the Benson Ford Research Center in Dearborn, certainly include many speeches that he gave throughout his lifetime for ecumenical understanding. This is also a picture of him giving a check to the UJA, to Max Fisher from the Ford Motor Company. His relationship with Sidney Weinberg, who is the senior partner of Goldman Sachs, again, who is largely credited with bringing the IPO to fruition, is an example of the difference between the generations of Fords. Though interestingly, Ford II said that he did not believe that Weinberg had close ties to Jewish networks, charities, or friends. So how did they meet? Weinberg met Henry Ford II in 1947 while he was serving on the Business Advisory Council of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which Weinberg called, quote, a great place to meet people. Much of what we know about the IPO comes from E.J. Kahn Jr.'s profile on Weinberg for The New Yorker in 1956, for which he interviewed Weinberg several times in 1955 and 1956. E.J. Kahn's papers, which are amazing, are at the New York Public Library's Manuscript and Archives Division. And according to his notes, which are much more revealing than the actual articles that came out in The New Yorker, Weinberg met with Ford II about the IPO in New York on October 1st, 1953, and that was the first time that they discussed the possibility of Ford becoming public, and Henry Ford asked Weinberg to represent him on that day. So there's a very kind of a longer treatment of how the IPO came to be, which is a subject for another time, but suffice to say that Weinberg's role in organizing the Ford deal, which started at least in 1948, so there's hints of him sending letters to other people that he knew that served on the Ford Foundation board about whether or not young Henry would be interested in basically taking the motor company public, at least since 1948. It's really a testament to the kind of patience and long game that's needed for an investment banker in mid-century. And after the IPO, Weinberg joined the board of the Ford Motor Company, where he remained a director until his death in 1969. In Kahn's notes, he talks about how he had to switch out his cars for Ford cars. And in an oral history that Ford II gave in 1982, Henry says that he had enormous respect for Weinberg, that he considered him to be a close friend, and Weinberg seemed to be incredibly influential in picking people to serve on the Ford board. So what does the Ford Syndicate reveal about the origins of the top investment banks of mid-century? Now, we have to remember that one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get information on these banks is precisely because they were private. So they did not have to file their information with the government, right? It's all private information. It's not public at all. And so that is one of the reasons why, as a historian, I had to look at the genealogies of the banks. So if we were to look at the Ford syndicate sample as a whole, and this is the small sample of the Jewish banks, the genealogies show that more than 60% of the 207 firms were at one time family partnerships, and most of them started as entrepreneurial ventures. So for this reason, the Ford is really also an example of how the literature on economic elites intersects with the study of family firms, because most of them were family firms. 30 of the firms, or 14%, so it was small, had founders who were first-generation immigrants. But many more of the firms, their founders were descendants of immigrants, either the second or third generation. The 31 firms who were founded by men who identified as Jewish. The dominant characteristic of this group is that 29 out of 31, or 94%, were founded by Jewish men who were either German or Austrian by birth, or German or Austrian descent up to the third generation. That this suggests that their collective history takes place within the context of a larger narrative of German immigration to the United States, much more than their peers. There were only 2 firms with Jewish founders in the Ford syndicate sample that did not have German or Austrian background. They were Lazard Frère, which was French in origin, 3 brothers, Alex, Ellie, and Simon, who immigrated to New Orleans in 1848. They participated in the San Francisco Gold Rush. And then M.A. Shapiro and Company. This is a really interesting bank whose founder, Morris Shapiro, was from Lithuania. He was born in 1903, died actually in 1996. He was a graduate of Columbia. He had a younger brother, Meyer, who was also a graduate of Columbia, did his PhD in art history, was a professor at Columbia for a very long time. Incidentally, they were raised in Brownsville in Brooklyn. If you go to the Brooklyn Museum, there is a wing dedicated to the Shapiros that Morris underwrote in honor of his brother. Not all, and so they were originally from Lithuania. Not all of the German and Austrian founders in the Ford syndicate were Jewish. 14 of the 207 had founders that were Jewish or Austrian or German descent, but they were not Jewish. So one example is Drexel and Company, whose founder, for example, was Catholic. So is this larger story a German immigrant one and not a Jewish one? You know, in order to see whether or not there were differences in the development of the firms based on the religious affiliation of the founders, I looked at them together, German-Jewish firms, German-only firms, and then analyzed them. And as we see, there is a subtle difference. So for example, once a private partnership was founded, it often became a place of employment for members of the founder's family and succeeding generations. And this allowed you to maintain capital within the firm, right? So if you withdraw capital, then it undermines your base. For all of the firms, the rate of generational succession was about 2 generations. So that's for all, Jewish and non-Jewish. Out of the 207 firms, more than half had a son of the founder who joined the firm, so about 62%. And we see relatively similar percentages when we look at firms with Jewish founders or non-Jewish founders. But those founded by Germans who were not Jewish show a marked different divergence from their peers. There's a much greater percentage of German founders, 86% had a son who joined the family firm. But the one difference, particular difference for German Jewish firms is when we look at the way in which male relatives of the second generation who were not the son joined the family firm. So 19 out of 31 of the firms with Jewish founders had a male relative of the founder join the firm. This is a much higher percentage than their peers. And this statistic really lends credence to Barry Supple's contention that Jewish bankers opened their firms to provide employment for their families in high finance, with the implications that they could not get jobs in firms founded by non-Jews because of discrimination. So this is very strong evidence of the general effects of anti-Semitism on the structure of the Jewish family banking network in this period. Over time, though, and again, this is one of the reasons why we need to look at it over time and why the Ford Syndicate, looking at their genealogies, is so important is that these do not last, meaning that the anti-Semitism's effects are not uniformly consistent in molding the parameters of the community. And a major precipitating factor is the generational change within the family networks. But another reason is that at some point in their histories, all of the Jewish family firms began to include partners who were neither family members and not Jewish. So there's an increasing diversification. If a Jewish bank was considered Jewish, if its founder was Jewish, what happens when the founder dies and when his family leaves the firm? Does that change the identity of the bank? By the late 20th century, given the evidence of the diversity of their networks, which includes intermarriage, alliances with non-Jewish firms, that these banks continued to have relationships that tied them to Jewish historical communities in the face of generational change. Again, we have to think of this as a historical question, and what we find is, like most of the syndicate, the Jewish firms did not remain family firms. Only 20% of the 207 syndicate firms had a family member as the head when it ceased to be independent. As we shall see, then most of the firms did not survive past the 20th century. Did the origin of the founders or their religious identities impact the rate of survival? The answer is no. So these are a list of the firms that still exist. One very interesting thing that I noted about this, which is something that I would say is future research, is that I think there were only 9 firms originally from St. Louis among the 207, and 3 of them have survived. This is a remarkable, from a kind of a statistical point of view, this is kind of remarkable. It makes me think there's something going on specifically in St. Louis, but I have not yet been able to investigate it. So given the changes in the context of the firm, we also have to think about the changes in the size and the makeup of the firm. Probably Kuhn Loeb, I think, in the 20s with about 50 partners, possibly about 200 employees. By the time they merged with Lehman Brothers in 1979, we had thousands of employees. Is it meaningful to call any of these survivors Jewish today? This is a question that's been raised about Goldman Sachs, who is the only co-manager, again, to remain in business independently under its own name. In 1999, Goldman went public and became a corporation. It had its own syndicate. It led its own syndicate. It had a team of 129 American underwriters. There were only 13 on the tombstone. The firm was valued at $91.8 billion, and as of June 2018, it had 36,000 employees. Yet, according to Michael Kinsley and others, Goldman is still, quote, thought of as a Jewish firm. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency, for example, has called it a, quote, heavily Jewish-run firm. So what does it actually mean to call Goldman a Jewish bank in the 21st century? So this is one of the things that I wanted to turn to. This is a close-up of the Barron's tombstone, and the ones that are circled are the ones that are left standing. You could see that. So Goldman Sachs' history has many of the elements that we've seen in the narratives of the other Jewish banks in the 4 data sets, starting with a journey from Germany and having a foundation as a family partnership. Its founder, Marcus Goldman, was born in Bavaria. His father was in the business of livestock. Marcus became a teacher, but in 1848 he immigrated to the United States, being pushed by the pressures of industrialization and also trapped by political repression against Jews in Germany. He moved to Philadelphia, where he worked as a peddler in household goods. This is a very common story. In 1850, he married Bertha Goldman, no relation, a fellow German immigrant who was a seamstress whom he met in Philadelphia. And over time, he amassed enough capital to open up a men's clothing store. And in 1867, he actually closed up shop. He returned briefly to Germany. And then when he came back, he relocated to New York, and that's where he opened the firm of M. Goldman, banker and broker. And his specialty was commercial paper, which has meant that he would go around to businesses. And here you can see where your network is really important, because you go around, you know which businesses are doing well. You buy their promissory notes at a discount, and then he would go uptown, and then he would sell them to commercial banks. And over time, when his children came of age and married, Marcus turned to his family to expand the firm. Julius actually did not become a banker. He was the oldest son. He graduated from Columbia Law School. He became a lawyer, though, for Marcus's firm. He also acted as a lawyer at times for Kuhn Loeb. Henry, who was the youngest son, studied at Harvard briefly. He later joined the family firm. Like Henry, all three of Marcus and Bertha's son-in-laws joined the firm, two of whom were sons of his childhood friend, Joseph Sachs. So like Marcus, Joseph was a teacher. His father had been a saddle maker. He immigrated to the United States in 1847, settling first in Baltimore. Unlike Marcus, though, Joseph continued his profession as a teacher in the United States, and he and his wife Sophia had 6 children, 5 of whom survived into adulthood: Julius, Samuel, Amelia, Henry, and Bernard. And Joseph unfortunately died in 1868, and then Sophia died 4 years later. And Marcus and Bertha took a hand in looking after their children. The youngest, Bernard, was only 14 when his mother passed. Incidentally, Bernard graduated from Harvard in 1878. He studied medicine in 1882. He became a prominent neurologist and is credited with identifying what became known as Tay-Sachs disease. Yes, I was really surprised to find that too. Yes. These are the things that happen when you do genealogies. All these really interesting things come out. So they had a very close extended family network connected by ethnic, national, and religious ties. And during the first 3 generations of the firm's founders, these kinship networks were clearly central to the firm's makeup. In 1880, Marcus and Bertha were living in the same house with their daughter's families, their son Julius's family, and Henry Sachs. 6 years later, when Marcus and Bertha's daughter Rosa had married Joseph and Sophia's son Julius Sachs, who had graduated from Columbia, he became a well-known educator. In 1878, their youngest daughter, Louisa, married Joseph and Sophia's son Samuel, who worked as a bookkeeper in the dry goods business, and it is Samuel who the Goldman & Sachs refers to. So in 1882, he joined Marcus, and that's when the firm became M. Goldman & Sachs, and then when Marcus made Samuel partner later, the firm became Goldman & Sachs. So Henry Goldman joined the firm in 1885. He was the youngest son. Ludwig Dreyfus, who was a picture dealer who was married to Marcus's daughter Rebecca. And in 1894, Joseph Sachs' son Henry also. So it just continues to grow. Samuel Sachs's 3 sons, Paul, Arthur, and Walter, also entered the firm. And Walter was really the last of the family to leave. I believe he stayed in the firm until at least 1959. So the partners' kinship and ethnic groups also influenced the firm's business networks, which were tied to the Jewish communities in the United States, specializing in dry goods, retail, and clothing, which were traditional areas of business for Jewish immigrants in the United States. And this is where Julius Rosenwald's story comes into the picture. So in 1872, Samuel Sachs's sister Amelia married a clothing manufacturer named Samuel Hammerslau, who was the son of a dry goods dealer. By the time he had immigrated to the United States in about 1859-60, he had 3 older brothers, Julius, Louis, and Edward, who had established themselves in the retail clothing business in Baltimore, and they had moved to Illinois. And they were really only one of many Jewish retail clothing merchants in the city like New York, New Orleans, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, and advances in the technology of sewing machines really offered great opportunities for ready-made clothing that the Hammerslaus and also the Goldmans really benefited. So in 1857, the Hammerslau sister Augusta married a German Jewish immigrant named Samuel Rosenwald, who was the son of a merchant, and he had had experience in mercantile trade before leaving for Baltimore in 1854. And he is the father of Julius Rosenwald. When Julius was about 16, he moved to New York to work for his uncles as a stock clerk. And during this time, he lived with either his uncle Edward or his uncle Samuel, who was married to Samuel Sachs's sister. And eventually he goes into business. And his story, you probably know very well, is that in 1895, when the opportunity presents himself, he and his brother-in-law buy half of the interest in Sears Roebuck and Company from Richard Sears. And in 1906, when sales hit about $50 million, he approached Henry Goldman, who was his cousin by marriage, whom he had known from his time in New York, about a loan. And Henry suggested, don't do a loan, take the firm public. So in 1906, Goldman Sachs underwrites the initial public offering for Sears Roebuck. It was about $8.7 million. of 7% preferred stock, another $2 million in common stock. And as you know, the IPO made Rosenwald a billionaire. It really enabled him to create his mark as a prominent philanthropist. And as for Goldman Sachs, the IPO marked very auspicious beginnings. As Walter Sachs stated, quote, that Sears business was the thing that began to give us this very great reputation in industrial securities, because that was followed by all kinds of business. So like most underwriters, so now we're beginning to see why it is that we might be calling Goldman a Jewish bank in this time period, because of its networks, because of its founders, and also because of its friends. So like most underwriters, Goldman could not assume, again, as I said, all the risk within this deal. And given that it was not well known as an underwriter, it had to rely on the personal relationships of its partners at this time. And a prominent collaborator was Lehman Brothers, because one of the sons of the founder, Philip Lehman, was a very good friend of Henry Goldman, and this personal friendship created the basis for an informal and a lucrative partnership between the two family firms. So according to Supple, from 1906 to 1924, they headed 144 issues for 56 issuers. They eventually decided to split their client list in 1936. They had a bit of a falling out, which partly started in 1917 when Henry Goldman was pushed out of his own family firm because he disagreed with his partners over his allegiance to Germany during the First World War. And he basically could not stay. So until mid-century, Goldman Sachs' identity could then be viewed as a reflection of the founder's personal history, its families, its extended networks. In this context, defining Goldman Sachs as a Jewish bank is not an essentialist label. It's not one that privileges the impact of anti-Semitism in American society in defining Jewish communal identity. Its history could be written and told as a story of a family bank in a large community. But after the makeup and the structure of the firm separates from its familial roots, and as its community of peers begins to disappear, what historical characteristics and identify Goldman as a Jewish bank besides its past? Now, one of the suggestions that appears in the post-family era of the investment bank is that the bank's identity derives from the personalities and networks of its senior partners, starting with Sidney Weinberg, as if to say that, no, there's no longer the family, but you still have this leader who can define the identity of the firm. Now, in some ways, Weinberg's rise to senior partner is actually a departure for Goldman Sachs. He was a Brooklyn native. He grew up in Red Hook. He was the son of a wholesale liquor dealer. His parents were not of German background. They were Eastern European Jewish immigrants. He was Jewish, but he was from a distinctly different class background than his partners. And his first job at Goldman Sachs in 1907 was the janitor's assistant. So Weinberg served in the First World War. He returned to the firm to work in the bond department, and he became a partner in 1927, and he made partner in 1930. Now, despite his humble beginnings, or some would say because of them, few have left a kind of outsized mark on the firm's identity in the way that Weinberg did between 1930 and 1969 when he died. Now, that's not to say his successors lacked kind of bold personalities, but Weinberg not only had the longest tenure, he was also the only partner who formed something of a dynasty when his son, John Weinberg, succeeded Sidney's successor, Gus Levy, who was from New Orleans, also Jewish, in 1976. And for the first 4 years, John was actually co-senior partners with John Whitehead. John Weinberg's older brother, Sidney Weinberg Jr., also became a partner in Goldman Sachs. He was the head of the investment banking division. So, but since that time, if you look at the history of the bank, Goldman Sachs has had both Jewish and non-Jewish senior partners and executives. So Hank Paulson is a Scientologist, I believe. No, it's not a Scientologist. It's a Christian Scientist, sorry. I'm spreading rumors. And Corzine is, there was actually an article about him, how he's very difficult to pin down what exactly he is. Is he Italian? Is he's like, he doesn't really want to talk about his ethnicity. But there's a mix. And their religious affiliation has been emphasized to varying degrees. For example, in 2013, when Lloyd Blankfein, who was the firm's then chief executive officer, received the Gustav L. Levy Award, named after Gus Levy, at a fundraising dinner for the UJA Federation of New York, he, quote, recalled the role of his rabbi and Jewish organizations in helping him realize he could succeed despite growing up in a working class neighborhood, unquote. He said something like the only Jewish person he'd ever seen in a suit was his rabbi. By contrast, very little is written about the religious background of the current chief executive officer, David Solomon. Much more, if you try and find information on Solomon, much more is written about his interest in electronic dance music. So he's the DJ on the side. Which is to say that we know very little, actually, about the religious affiliations of contemporary bankers unless they make it public. So it's such a contrast. You can imagine how difficult it is to do research today as it is when somebody is dead and you can go look through all their papers, right? And the difference between looking at the social register and looking at it today. So the idea in this case, when you have this situation, can you really say that the personal commitments of different executives define the identity of investment banks in the 21st century? The idea being that the senior partner can take on the mantle of the founding families in defining the identity of a firm or the Jewish identity of the firm. It's very common, but fundamentally it's very ahistorical, and it tends to be inconsistent because the senior chief executive officer changes over time. The other thing is that, like all large American corporations, Goldman Sachs operates in a post-Great Depression, post-Civil Rights Act era, and they, like most large publicly owned corporations, they track and highlight their efforts at diversity. In this context, is it reasonable to identify Goldman as a Jewish bank today? I think that in order to answer this question, we again have to return to the idea of community. We cannot simply study one bank on its own. We have to look at the top corporate underwriters in the 21st century. We have to look at how, who they are, how do they compare to the Ford Syndicate, who are the executives, are there Jewish bankers present, is there a network? How do they compare to their peers? Are their relationships unique? Do their networks have an impact on the network of the firm? It's very difficult to do that kind of research for the reasons that I gave, but these are the areas of future research without which a historical definition of a Jewish bank today, I think, would have very little meaning. Now, to return to the question of the impact of anti-Semitism in Jewish identity, I think the strongest contemporary argument for engaging in a debate over Jews and money and finance and economics is not necessarily an academic one, because what we see is that definitions of Jewish identity and subjects are already being created. They have a historicity, an actuality of its own. So studying the specific, so we can't just ignore that. I would recommend not to ignore that. I would recommend to engage, because studying that specificity allows us to appreciate, frankly, the extent to which Jewishness has not only been defined by anti-Semitism. It is possible, of course, to speculate that bankers of Jewish faith are no longer confined to certain firms, and that the reason for this decline is a decline in anti-Semitism. I remember Ace Greenberg, who was chief executive officer for Bear Stearns at one point. There was a lot of controversy over women and minorities in investment banking, and he kind of said tongue-in-cheek, he goes, we even hire Jews, because of course he's Jewish. So this idea that, investment banks have become more open, that you would find Jewish bankers in all different firms, that they're not confined to certain firms, and this obviously would lend credence to the idea that anti-Semitism is the reason why Jewish bankers were in Jewish banks in the first place. But I think that this interpretation really also ignores the multiple traces that we have followed in their histories, individual stories and also as an aggregate, as a community. The history of American Jewish investment banking houses demonstrate that their identities and their networks were not created solely under duress. In many ways, the search for a unifying narrative in defining Jewish banks has privileged the role that anti-Semitism plays to the detriment of other realities, because as their oral histories attest, being Jewish was part of their lives and something much greater, with much greater meaning than exclusion. And I'll just end by saying, there are a number of wonderful oral histories we really benefit that they left for us. And Benjamin Butenweiser of Kuhn Loeb, who is married to Helen Lehman, was asked about Jewish identity in this oral history at Columbia. He was on the board of trustees. And for example, he was asked about James Spire, who's probably one of the older German banking firms in the United States if James Beyer was Jewish. James Beyer was married to a woman named Ellen Price who was not Jewish, and he said, quote, "Of course he was, and he never denied it one moment." Regarding himself, when Butenheiser was asked, "Do you feel more or less Jewish today than you did 10 years ago? How do you explain this feeling?" He replied, quote, "I don't feel the slightest difference. I was born and brought up to be a Jew, an American of the Jewish faith." Quote. He said, "As I see it, we are Americans of the Jewish faith, and I'm proud to be an American, and I'm equally proud of being a Jew," unquote. Regarding Sidney Weinberg, Keith Funston, who is the head of the New York Stock Exchange, who was a friend of his, told E.J. Kahn, "Weinberg's a Jew and proud of it." So to echo Rebecca Coburn and Adam Teller, these histories, quote, highlight the ways in which Jews wielded economic agency, unquote, even if in the circumstances not of their own choosing. And I think it is wonderful that there is a growth in the literature in American Jewish history that is embracing that. Thank you.
So we have time for questions, please.
Thank you very much. It's quite a wealth of information. And it's hard to formulate the question, but the one that sort of kept piquing my mind is you hit a tremendous amount of subjects, and one of them that sort of intrigued me, and I kept looking for the answer, and I probably missed it as you gave it, was as you described these bankers and the levels of it, and that it required individual trust because of their greater liability.
Yes.
And then you formulated the question, well, what was the basis of that trust?
Yes.
As we were talking about Jewish bankers and non-Jewish. And I kept looking for that, and I'm not sure I found that answer. I mean, you talked about German descent, but I don't know if that was your answer. I'm wondering if you could comment on what you found to be the basis of their trust in those days.
Well, I think that their trust was, I guess the point that I made about the book is that I think the very simple answer to your question is that they trusted each other because they believed in the character of the other person, that they were going to stand by their word. And in fact, one of the things that, when Morgan was on the stand during the money trust investigation, Samuel Untermeyer was trying to get him to say that money was really important. And he was like, "Money doesn't matter to me at all," which of course everyone was like, "Oh, how could he possibly say that?" But he said something like, "A person who I don't trust couldn't get all the money, couldn't get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. That it wasn't about how much money you had; it was about the character, the content of your character." And so I think that that's what was the basis of their trust. The question was, how do you get to that point in a context where the society has created so many barriers for that to happen? And so it was really, when I looked at women and the position of women, it was really about how you create those conditions where the men could be men and see each other in that way, meaning that they could look at the content of each other's character without having to think about these differences that were created in the society at large. But the simple answer to your question is, I think it would be that they trusted each other to keep their word. Yeah. Yes, and so to put it this way, it's that when women were not there, you could kind of interact as men. All right, so it was really more that the conditions, what were the conditions that allowed you to do that? Yeah. I don't know if that's...
On a different note, the head of Goldman Sachs now, his father was, disbarred or whatever from the Wall Street because of his lack of integrity, let's say. And it's widely rumored that the reason his son, David Solomon, became the head of Goldman Sachs is because he and Blankstein were both bald.
We're both
Bald.
bald.
So is there any truth to that?
I have to say, I have never heard that. And I think I've been hanging out with economists too long, because my first, yes, there's Chad, my first instinct is to say, if you were to try and and actually do a study and look at all of the bald men in Goldman Sachs and distinguish how he was able to one-up Harvey Schwartz, I think it would be very difficult to make that assessment. But yes, no, I've never heard that before.
My resume is ready.
Yes, okay. Yes. Chad, we have some people in the back over here.
You mentioned that this was not a sort of a passing comment. This is not a theological question, and the matter of religious practice didn't enter into it. And I'm reminded of a book by George Mosse, and after all, we are in the Mosse-Weinstein program here. George Mosse wrote a book called German Jews Beyond Judaism, and his point was that after the Jewish Enlightenment, after Moses Mendelssohn, there were among the Jewish community in Germany, people who felt very powerfully Jewish. They didn't deny that, but they also embraced what they saw as the best of German culture, that of Goethe and Schiller and Beethoven and so on, and the idea of Bildung, the development of themselves, and had this high cultural sense. I'm wondering whether you, in one sense, these sound like German Jews beyond Judaism, the sort that Mosse was talking about. On the other hand, did you find any element of content in their character that supported this idea that they also had some kind of sense of a higher calling of education and so on?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, in terms of the theological religious practices, one example is that if you look at the Butenweiser oral history, he talks about, you know, he was very skeptical, for example, of whether or not his grandmother was actually kosher, though she said that she was kosher in like her way. That's the way that he described it. And he did talk about, for example, Jacob Schiff. So one of the reasons why I say that it's not a religious distinction is because, for example, and people would make this comment, you know, like, oh, or the Rothschilds, for example, available to talk about deals on Saturday, that kind of thing. And his oral history is wonderful because it actually gives us a sense of what it was the partners were doing. So until 1952, starting around in the 1880s, the New York Stock Exchange was open for a half day on Saturdays. So, but Kuhn Loeb was also open. So, and there had to be at least one partner who was at the firm on Saturdays. And he says that usually it was Otto Kahn. And Otto Kahn was probably, you know, his daughter basically converted to Episcopalianism, and he, you know, he accused Pierpont Morgan of inappropriate religiosity, for example, because he sat on the Met board with Morgan, and Morgan was very offended by Salome. So he was the one who went the most often. But Jacob Schiff went to Temple on Saturdays, but he expected his mail to be delivered to him right after noontime, right? So you know, it's interesting how Devin was talking about these kind of practices. In terms of their Jewishness, in terms of their culture, that I would identify the most as kind of related to the religion is their support for philanthropy. I mean, they were kind of renowned, all of the partners, but particularly people like Schiff, Felix Warburg, who really did more philanthropy than banking. I mean, even the Morgans would talk about this, actually. They would say, well, you know, Felix is not really around. But all of them did, including the women. And I think that they really saw that very much as a calling, both for Jewish philanthropies and non-Jewish philanthropies. So that I would say that that's probably the strongest evidence of that. And I could have talked about just that as well.
What role, if any, did these firms have in the creation of the State of Israel in 47, 48?
That is a really interesting question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, I can tell you that if you were to look at Jacob Schiff, for example, as an example, Jacob Schiff was not a Zionist by any stretch of the imagination. And so but he dies in 1920, so it's not, probably relevant. In terms of the other partners, particularly in Kuhn Loeb, many of the ones that were the most active in Jewish philanthropy, actually, and this is what actually causes a crisis within the firm, is that many of them die actually in the 30s. So Mortimer Schiff dies in the 30s, Felix Warburg dies in the 30s, Jerome Hanover also dies in the 30s, and so it's hard to say what role that they would have played. What their successors had, I don't know. That's a great question.
In my business, I have clients, and I always see if the second and third generation will continue working in the business. What you have shown between the two dates of all those companies, and every single one but one no longer exists, is pretty, what I found as well, is that it's very difficult to have third generation handle the business. And
Yes.
the investment banking business is a very difficult business to make money, and you can lose a lot of money and get into trouble. So what a lot of those companies were simply mergers. It was much smarter to take your money, move it into a bigger company, and walk away with bonds or stocks, rather than seeing whether your dumb kid will be able to continue to run that company.
Well, there was so much value in the name of the bank. I think they would have continued, not necessarily just the family, but the name. But one of the things that I look at in the Ford Syndicate project is when they started to go out of business. And most of them start to go out of business right around 1968 to 1974. So most of them are gone before 1987. So it's actually an exogenous issue, I think, why they go out of business. Otherwise, I think they would have continued. And that is, you have the back office crisis with the changes in technology. And then you also have a very terrible bear market and high interest rates that happened in the 70s, and that really wipes them out. So they have, when you time it out, and that's one of the reasons, it doesn't make any difference if you were founded by Jews or non-Jews. This is the period in which in the U.S., in financial history, that these investment brokerage houses are either merging or they're going out of business. The one thing that I thought of, to answer your question in terms of generations, is that there is only one firm in the entire syndicate that, of the 207 that I studied, that has a female chief executive officer. And she inherits the firm, it's A.M. Kidder and Company, a woman named Josephine Bay, because her husband was a majority shareholder and then he died. And she either had to sell, according to the New York Stock Exchange rules, or she had to have an executive role, and she decided to have an executive role. But she is the only one. And I wonder what it would have been like because there are women who are entering into financial firms, but they're not taking over their family firms. One bank called Effie Eberstadt and Company, the founder, Ferdy Eberstadt, was actually Presbyterian by religion, but he had Jewish relatives, and his uncle was actually related to Otto Kahn. And he was close with Bob Lehman, he was close with Benjamin Butenweiser, and he actually has a son who becomes a really well-known fashion photographer. So he did not want to go into finance. He tried, he left, he becomes a really well-known fashion photographer. And I think he might also possibly go into psychology. But he had daughters who, according to, there's a biography written about him called The Will to Win, about how his children, after he died, I believe in it might have been 69, that they wanted to take over the firm and they were not able to. And so I always thought, there's a story there, particularly about women when they join financial services, after women have more access to education, higher education in the mid-20th century. Why is it that the daughters of the fathers are not joining the firms? And I think that has to do largely with the way in which the investment banking community is gendered. But to answer your question, I wonder if they had, like Elizabeth I, if they could see a woman as a leader of the firm, if that would have actually led to the generations going past 2, if they had considered opening it up to women. But that is very speculative history, I have to say. That's going in the realm of speculative history.